Yes, these kind of projects are extremely important to us in the downstream recycling of such materials as plastics. We have to realize that there are a number of things that the European Union wants to attain whilst recycling these e-wastes. And if we look at the plastics particularly, we need to make sure that they are recycled in line with this legislation. In other words, we need to separate off brominated flame retardants. And much of the plastics from e-waste are currently being traded and are going to places where we know that things like separation of brominated flame retardants isn't happening. So we are extremely pleased that projects like these do develop, and there are some other initiatives in Europe that help making sure that this recycling is done in line with what the purpose of the legislation is. There is a huge difference. There is a huge difference between the approaches that the various regions in the world do. If we look at Europe, Europe is leading in terms of legislation. The legislation is there, and you can say this industry in Europe is a legislation-driven industry. If we look at the United States, where there is no legislation, there is hardly any recycling taking place. But on the other hand, in the United States, they work on creating markets for recycled content, and therefore there is a difference between this push of the legislation or the pull of a market. Now, right now, in the States, it's at the very beginning. In Europe, we are much further and we have clear rules. If we look at places like the Far East, there are a few countries where there are rules. Japan has clear rules. China is trying to implement rules, and it will certainly get there. Taiwan is having some rules in place. So we start to get there, but let's not forget, Europe is in this respect really leading. Well, the proper recycling is important because the products that we produce, if they want to be put again into high-tech products, they need to comply with legislation such as REACH and RoHS. So these things are there. We are at the same time discussing with the producers of electronics to make sure that they design products that do use plastics that can indeed be recycled again. Yeah, and sometimes this is a little bit in conflict, because clearly we need to put flame retardants in the products, and then we need to separate these flame retardants. So there is some conflicts in there, but there is a lot of debate starting to happen that wasn't taking place in the past. Ideally, you would have a market in place where there is legislation that makes sure that there is recycling taking place. At the same time, we need to develop that there is going to be markets in place that take these products to be used. So that's already, how do you count these wishes? Is that 2 wishes or is that only 1?
3 wishes.
This is only 1, right?
Yeah.
So then continue.
Yeah.
We need to have legislation in place.
We are closing to Christmas, so
yeah, exactly.
I
can continue.
Wish more.
So the second wish is that we create legislation that is in line with Mr. Barroso's wish. You probably have heard Mr. Barroso in his State of the Union declared that he wants to create millions of green-collar jobs to supplement the white and the blue workers. Now, if we want to make this happen, we need to have legislation that is there, that doesn't stop recycling, but that promotes recycling. And in that respect, I was very pleased to hear that the recent RoHS recast was not including an Annex 3 listing, for instance, because that would have been a serious problem. So that's the second one in place. And then the third one is that we really take these things up in a global perspective, because then we really get the quantities of materials that we need.